Elijah McCoy choked on the acrid smoke as Fort Pillow erupted in chaos. Confederate flags, stark against the bruised sky, replaced the tattered Union banner. He saw men, black men like him, throwing down their rifles, hands raised in surrender. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm him. He'd seen battles before, but this felt different. "Elijah!" "Get down!" Sergeant Davies's voice, raspy with fear, cut through the din. He dropped to his knees behind a crumbling barricade, the rough earth scraping against his skin. The air reeked of gunpowder and blood. The screams. God, the screams. They were unlike anything he had ever heard. Davies, a grizzled veteran with eyes that had seen too much, peered over the top. "They ain't taking prisoners, Elijah. They're slaughtering them." Elijah's stomach twisted. He couldn't believe it. Surrender was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to offer a sliver of humanity amidst the barbarity of war. He risked a glance. The scene confirmed Davies's grim words. Confederate soldiers, their faces contorted with a savage glee, moved among the surrendered Union troops, bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun. There was no mercy in their eyes, only a cold, methodical brutality. "We gotta get out of here," Davies hissed, grabbing his arm. "Now, but where could they go?" The fort was surrounded. Escape seemed impossible. He saw Lieutenant Thompson, his face white with terror, trying to rally a handful of men near the riverbank. It was a futile gesture. "They'll kill us if we stay," Elijah said, his voice barely a whisper. Davies nodded grimly. "And they'll kill us if we run. But I ain't gonna die on my knees," he spat on the ground. "We fight." He leveled his rifle, taking aim at a Confederate officer directing the carnage. Elijah hesitated for only a second before following suit. He had sworn an oath to defend the Union, to fight for his freedom. He would not break that oath. Not even in the face of certain death, the officer fell. A ripple of confusion spread through the Confederate ranks. It wouldn't last long, but it was enough. "Now!" Davies yelled, charging forward, rifle blazing. Elijah followed, a primal scream tearing from his throat. He had no illusions about their chances, but he would not die a victim. He would die a soldier. "Now!" Davies yelled, charging forward, rifle blazing. Elijah followed, a primal scream tearing from his throat. He had no illusions about their chances, but he would not die a victim. He would die a soldier. The world became a blur of smoke, screams, and the thunderous crack of gunfire. Elijah charged, adrenaline coursing through him, a desperate prayer on his lips. He fired his rifle, the recoil slamming into his shoulder, felt a fleeting satisfaction as a Confederate soldier crumpled to the ground. But for every one he felled, two more seemed to take his place. The Confederates, momentarily stunned, quickly rallied. They poured fire into the remaining Union soldiers, a hail of lead tearing through flesh and bone. The air filled with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Elijah saw Davies cut down, a crimson stain blossoming on his chest before he hit the muddy ground. Elijah felt a surge of grief, quickly followed by a cold, hard rage. He was alone now, a lone wolf facing a pack of ravenous hounds. He ducked behind a fallen log, frantically reloading his rifle. His hands trembled, slick with sweat and blood. He could hear the shouts of the Confederates closing in, their bloodlust palpable. "Come on out, nigger," one of them yelled, his voice thick with venom. "We ain't gonna hurt you at much." Elijah gritted his teeth. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't break. He took a deep breath, steadied his rifle, and peered over the log. He saw a Confederate soldier, young, barely more than a boy, aiming his rifle directly at him. Their eyes met. For a fleeting moment, Elijah saw a flicker of humanity in the boy's eyes, a hesitation, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. The boy squeezed the trigger. Elijah reacted instinctively, ducking back behind the log, just as the bullet whizzed past his head. He knew he couldn't stay there. He was trapped, a sitting duck. He had to move. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, and sprinted towards the riverbank. He heard the shouts of the Confederates behind him, the thud of their boots on the ground, the deadly whine of bullets tearing through the air. He could feel them closing in. He reached the riverbank, the cold water lapping at his boots. He looked out at the swirling current, the treacherous rapids. It was a desperate gamble, but it was his only chance. He plunged into the water, the icy shock stealing his breath. The current immediately seized him, pulling him downstream with relentless force. He struggled to keep his head above water, fighting against the swirling eddies and the jagged rocks. He heard the shouts of the Confederates on the bank, saw their figures silhouetted against the sky. They were firing at him, the bullets kicking up sprays of water around him. He knew he was a moving target, exposed and vulnerable. He ducked under the surface, holding his breath until his lungs burned. He needed to get away to find some cover. He spotted a cluster of rocks further downstream, a small island in the middle of the river. He kicked with all his might, fighting against the current, desperately trying to reach it. Finally, gasping for breath, he reached the rocks. He hauled himself onto the slippery surface, collapsing in exhaustion. He was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes heavy and clinging. But he was alive. For now, he peered back at the riverbank. The Confederates were still there, pacing back and forth, their faces grim. They hadn't given up. They knew he was somewhere in the river. They would wait. Elijah knew he couldn't stay on the rocks forever. He was exposed, vulnerable. He needed to find a way to escape, to disappear. He scanned the shoreline, searching for any sign of hope. He saw a small patch of woods further downstream, a dense thicket of trees and undergrowth. It was his only chance. He would have to risk the river again, to brave the current and the bullets. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the ordeal. He knew the odds were stacked against him. But he had survived Fort Pillow. He had survived the massacre. He would not give up now. He slipped back into the water, the icy current immediately engulfing him. He pushed off from the rocks, striking out towards the woods. The Confederates opened fire, the bullets snapping past his head. He ducked under the surface, swimming with all his might, ignoring the burning in his lungs. He finally reached the shoreline, collapsing onto the muddy bank, gasping for breath. He crawled into the woods, pushing through the dense undergrowth. Putting as much distance as possible between himself and the river, he kept moving, deeper and deeper into the woods, until he could no longer hear the shouts of the Confederates. He finally stopped, leaning against a tree, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. He was alone, lost and wounded, but he was alive. He had survived. And he knew with a certainty that burned in his soul that he would not rest until he had made them pay. He would not rest until he had avenged the fallen. He would not rest until justice was served. The massacre at Fort Pillow would not be forgotten. Not by him. Elijah leaned against the rough bark, the cold seeping into his bones despite the exertion. Each ragged breath sent shards of pain through his chest, a reminder of the bullet that had grazed his ribs. He pressed a trembling hand against the wound, the makeshift bandage already soaked with blood. "Damn them," he rasped, the words barely audible above the rustling leaves. Damn them all to hell. He needed to find shelter, to staunch the bleeding. He couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. He pushed himself off the tree, his legs protesting with every step. The woods were a labyrinth of shadows and tangled branches, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. As he stumbled deeper, he heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind. A dog barking. Hope, fragile as a newborn bird, fluttered in his chest. Where there were dogs, there were people. And where there were people, there might be help. He followed the sound, his pace quickening despite the pain. He came to a small clearing, and there it was. A dilapidated cabin, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. A scrawny hound dog, its ribs showing through its matted fur, stood sentinel on the porch, barking incessantly. He hesitated. Approaching strangers, especially in these times, was a gamble, but he had no choice. He was running on fumes, his body failing him. He had to take the risk. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Is anyone there?" The barking intensified. The cabin door creaked open, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the dim light. It was a woman, old and weathered, her face etched with the lines of hardship. She held a shotgun in her hands, its barrel pointed squarely at Elijah's chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp and wary. "What do you want?" He raised his hands, palm open, trying to appear non-threatening. "Ma'am, my name is Elijah. I need help. I'm wounded." Her eyes narrowed, scrutinizing him. "Wounded, you say? By who? What side are you on?" He swallowed hard. He knew what she was asking. This far south, allegiances were everything. He could lie, claim to be Confederate, but the lie would choke him. Besides, she'd see through it. "I was with the Union," he said, his voice low, "at Fort Pillow." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken horror. The woman's expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, understanding perhaps, or maybe just pity. "Fort Pillow," she repeated, her voice softer now. "Come closer, boy. Let me see you." He took a tentative step forward, the dog barking a warning. She lowered the shotgun slightly, but kept it trained on him. He reached the porch and she stepped aside, allowing him to enter the cabin. The interior was small and sparsely furnished. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the rough-hewn walls. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something medicinal. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a stool near the fire. He lowered himself onto it, his body aching with relief. She knelt beside him, examining his wound. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her fingers probing with a practiced hand. "Bullet graze," she said. "Lucky for you. Could have been a lot worse." She rummaged in a wooden chest, pulling out a roll of bandages and a small jar of ointment. "This will sting," she warned as she began to clean the wound. He gritted his teeth, enduring the pain. He watched her, trying to gauge her intentions. He still didn't know if he could trust her. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't look up. "Doesn't matter why," she said. "What matters is you need help, and I'm here." She finished bandaging the wound, then handed him a cup of water. He drank it gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "Rest," she said. "You need to regain your strength. The woods are full of dangers." He nodded, leaning back against the wall. He was exhausted, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still in danger. He was a Union soldier, alone and wounded in the heart of Confederate territory. He was a fugitive, hunted and despised, and he had a burning desire for revenge. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes fixed on her. She hesitated for a moment, then met his gaze. "They call me Martha," she said. "Martha Hayes," he nodded slowly. "Thank you, Martha Hayes," he said. "Thank you for your kindness." He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under. But even as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he couldn't stay here for long. He had a mission, a purpose. He had to find a way to get back to his lines, to tell them what had happened at Fort Pillow. He had to make sure that the massacre was not forgotten. He had to make them pay. And he would one way or another. He nodded slowly. "Thank you, Martha Hayes," he said. "Thank you for your kindness." He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under. But even as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he couldn't stay here for long. He had a mission, a purpose. He had to find a way to get back to his lines, to tell them what had happened at Fort Pillow. He had to make sure that the massacre was not forgotten. He had to make them pay. And he would, one way or another. Martha didn't move, just watched him sleep. The rise and fall of his chest was shallow, labored. Outside, the wind howled a mournful tune through the gaps in the cabin walls. She stirred the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. 300 black soldiers, butchered. The horror of it settled heavy on her heart. It was a dark stain on a war already drenched in blood. Elijah stirred, mumbling something unintelligible. Martha placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. He flinched, his eyes fluttering open. "Easy now," she said softly. "Just rest." He blinked, focusing on her face. "How long?" "You've been asleep a few hours." "The fever's still holding on." He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his shoulder. He groaned and fell back against the pillow. "Don't push yourself," Martha warned. "You're in no condition to be moving around." "I have to—" he began, then stopped, his jaw tightening. "They need to know." "What happened there?" "At Fort Pillow." Martha sat down on a stool beside the bed. "I heard some talk," she said cautiously. "Whispers carried on the wind. Terrible things." Elijah closed his eyes, the images flashing behind his eyelids. The screams, the smoke, the blood. The cold, merciless eyes of the Confederate soldiers as they cut down men who had surrendered. They showed no mercy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "None, even after we raised the flag of surrender. They kept killing. They shot them in the back. They bayoneted them. They burned them alive." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. "They have to pay," Elijah said, his voice hardening. "Every last one of them. Revenge won't bring those men back," Martha said quietly. Elijah opened his eyes, his gaze burning into her. "Maybe not, but it might stop them from doing it again." It might make them think twice before they decide to slaughter defenseless men. He struggled to sit up again, ignoring the pain. Martha gently pushed him back down. "You're in no shape for revenge," she said firmly. "You need to heal. You need to get your strength back, and then you can decide what to do." Elijah stared at her, his face a mask of anger and frustration. He knew she was right, but he didn't want to hear it. He wanted to be out there, fighting, avenging the fallen. But his body betrayed him. He was weak, helpless, dependent on the charity of a woman he barely knew. How far? How far am I from Union lines? He asked finally. "Too far," Martha said. "At least 2 days' ride, maybe more. And this whole area is crawling with Confederate patrols." Elijah cursed under his breath. He was trapped. "They'll be looking for you," Martha continued. "They'll be searching every farm, every house, every barn. They won't want any witnesses. Then why are you helping me?" Elijah asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Martha looked away, her expression unreadable. I have my reasons," she said softly. "Let's just say, I don't hold with everything the Confederacy stands for." Elijah studied her face, trying to discern her motives. Was she telling the truth? Or was this some kind of trap? He couldn't afford to trust anyone, not now. "Thank you," he said cautiously. "But I can't stay here. It's too dangerous for both of us." "Where are you going to go?" Martha asked, her voice laced with concern. "You can barely stand." "I'll figure something out," Elijah said, his jaw set. "I always do." He pushed himself up again, ignoring the wave of dizziness that washed over him. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, swaying slightly. "You're a fool," Martha said, her voice sharp. "You'll get yourself killed." "Maybe," Elijah said, his eyes fixed on the door. "But I can't stay here and do nothing." He took a step towards the door, then another. He felt weak and unsteady, but he kept moving. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way to fight back. Martha watched him, her face etched with worry. She knew she couldn't stop him. He was a man driven by a purpose, by a burning desire for revenge. And she knew that one way or another, he would find a way to achieve it. "Wait," she said suddenly. Elijah stopped, turning to look at her. "Take this," she said, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a worn leather pouch. She handed it to him. He opened the pouch and peered inside. It was filled with gold coins. "What's this?" he asked, his brow furrowed. It's all I have," Martha said, her voice barely a whisper. "Use it to get yourself to safety. Use it to buy passage north." Elijah stared at the coins, then back at Martha. He was speechless. He couldn't believe that she was willing to give up everything for him, a complete stranger. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I can't take your money. You need it." "I want you to have it," Martha said, her eyes pleading. "Please, it's the least I can do." Elijah hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took the pouch. He closed his fingers around it, feeling the weight of the coins in his palm. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say." "Just promise me you'll use it wisely," Martha said. "Promise me you'll stay alive." "I promise," Elijah said, his eyes meeting hers. "I promise I'll do everything I can." He turned and walked towards the door, his steps more purposeful now. He still felt weak and wounded, but he had a new sense of determination. He had a purpose, a mission, and now he had the means to carry it out. He reached the door and paused, looking back at Martha. "Thank you," he said again. "You saved my life." He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, clean air. He looked up at the stars twinkling in the dark sky. He felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of possibility. He was still a fugitive, still hunted and despised. But he was alive, and he was ready to fight. He would find a way to get back to his lines. He would tell them what happened at Fort Pillow, and he would make them pay. He started walking, his steps slow but steady. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving. He had to keep fighting. He had to keep hope alive. The frost bit through the soles of his worn boots, but he pressed on. He wouldn't let the memory of Fort Pillow or the kindness of Martha Hayes be in vain. Elijah started walking, his steps slow but steady. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving. He had to keep fighting. He had to keep hope alive. The frost bit through the soles of his worn boots, but he pressed on. He wouldn't let the memory of Fort Pillow or the kindness of Martha Hayes be in vain. The first mile was agony. His muscles screamed in protest, his wounded leg a throbbing fire. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself forward. Each step was a victory against the despair that threatened to engulf him. He had to reach Union lines. He had to tell them. The world had to know what Forrest and his men had done. As the sky began to lighten, painting the horizon in pale hues of grey and pink, he stumbled upon a deserted road. He sank down behind a thicket of bare bushes, the cold seeping into his bones. He needed rest, but rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Still, he closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, picturing the faces of the men he'd left behind at Fort Pillow. Their cries echoed in his mind. A sound jolted him awake, the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves. He pressed himself deeper into the bushes, his heart pounding against his ribs. Confederate cavalry. He could smell the horses, the leather, the acrid scent of gunpowder. They were close. "Anything out here, Sergeant?" A voice called out, laced with a drawl so thick it could be cut with a knife. "Just scrub brush and frost, Captain," another voice replied. "Waste of time, if you ask me. The nigger's probably long gone." Elijah held his breath, every muscle tense. They were talking about him. He was sure of it. "Forrest wants him found," the captain said. "Dead or alive. Makes an example, you understand? Shows the rest what happens when they take up arms against us." The horses moved on, the sound fading into the distance. Elijah let out a shaky breath. He'd been lucky. Too lucky. He couldn't keep relying on luck. He needed a plan. He pushed himself to his feet, his leg protesting with a sharp stab of pain. The road. He had to stay off the road. Too exposed. He turned and plunged into the woods, the branches whipping at his face, the undergrowth thick and unforgiving. He walked for what felt like hours, his body numb with exhaustion and cold. He drank from a stream, the icy water stinging his throat. He chewed on a handful of dried berries he found clinging to a bush, their tartness doing little to quell his hunger. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows through the trees, he spotted a flicker of light in the distance. Their cabin. Hope surged through him, a fragile spark in the darkness. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he'd managed to salvage from the massacre. He crept closer, peering through a gap in the logs. Inside, an elderly woman sat by the fire, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. She was spinning wool, her hands moving with practiced ease. He hesitated. Could he trust her? Was she a friend or foe? He had no way of knowing, but he was desperate. He had to take the risk. He stepped out of the shadows and approached the cabin. He knocked softly on the door. The woman looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. She placed the spinning wheel down and slowly rose to her feet. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Ma'am," Elijah said, his voice hoarse. "My name is Elijah. I need help." The door creaked open a fraction, the woman peering out at him with suspicion. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. A flicker of compassion. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm a Union soldier," he said. I escaped from Fort Pillow. I need to get back to my lines." The woman stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, without a word, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "You look half frozen." Elijah walked for what felt like days, the memory of Fort Pillow a burning brand on his soul. He dodged patrols, scavenged for scraps, and clung to the hope that Martha's kindness had rekindled. Finally, he reached Union lines, gaunt and ragged but alive. He recounted the massacre at Fort Pillow, his voice hoarse with grief and rage. He spoke of the surrendered men, the Confederate flags, and the blood that stained the Mississippi. His story spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of General Grant himself. Lincoln, already burdened by the weight of the war, listened to the reports. The blatant disregard for the rules of war, the cold-blooded murder of surrendered black soldiers, solidified his resolve. He would not let such barbarity stand. "We will hold Confederate prisoners accountable," Lincoln declared, his voice firm despite the weariness etched on his face. "For every Union soldier murdered after surrender, a Confederate officer will face the same fate." The announcement sent shockwaves through both armies. Confederate commanders protested vehemently, accusing the Union of violating the rules of war. But Lincoln stood firm. Retaliation, though a grim necessity, was the only language they seemed to understand. Elijah, now back in uniform, felt a flicker of satisfaction. Justice, however imperfect, was finally being served. But the memory of Fort Pillow still haunted him, the faces of the fallen forever etched in his mind. The war raged on, each battle a testament to the brutality and senselessness of the conflict. Elijah fought with a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the memory of his fallen comrades and the hope of a better future. Finally, the tide began to turn. Union victories mounted, and the Confederacy crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The war was coming to an end. One crisp autumn evening, Elijah found himself standing on the banks of the Mississippi, not far from Fort Pillow. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He closed his eyes, remembering the day of the massacre, the chaos, the screams. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Martha. She had followed him, drawn by a sense of shared grief and a desire to witness the dawn of a new era. "It's over," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Elijah opened his eyes and looked at her. He saw the same hope in her eyes that he felt in his heart. The war was over, but the fight for equality, for justice, was just beginning. He looked out at the river, the water reflecting the fading light. He saw the faces of the fallen soldiers, their spirits finally at peace. He knew that their sacrifice would not be in vain. He would dedicate his life to ensuring that their deaths would pave the way for a better future. He turned to Martha, a faint smile gracing his lips. "It's just begun," he corrected her, his voice filled with determination. He took her hand and together they walked towards the